The Sega Dreamcast is a beloved console that was chock full of fantastic games. Despite only being around for a short time, it amassed an impressive number of releases many of us still play today. But beneath all those great fighting games, arcade ports, and original content, lurked a dark corner of the Dreamcast library that was not fit for man or beast. Games so bad they left an entire generation scarred from the experience of having owned and played them. I was in my mid-20s when the Dreamcast was available on the retail market, and even with years of gaming experience, I walked right into many of these completely unaware of just how terrible they actually were. Those memories of regret and disappointment have motivated me to make the video you are about to see. Just because I suffered through this lot doesn't mean you have to, and I've got 10 games for you to avoid like the plague. This one is gonna be rough, so let's get it over with. Welcome to Steaming Piles on the Sega Dreamcast. Our first turd was a 3D beat-em-up developed by the French studio Toka and released in November of 1999. Soul Fighter was the kind of game that upon first inspection might seem like something worth playing. And if you were a little kid, you might have gotten some fun out of mashing buttons and running around its 3D world. But if you were looking for a solid and well-made game here, you were gonna be supremely disappointed. The slow animation makes interactions with everything and everyone seem disjointed and unnatural. The combat has a strange flow that just doesn't feel right, and the moves available to you are shockingly limited. The camera is also way too close, limiting your view of the surrounding area and often obscuring the action. Then there's the fact you have trouble doing even the most basic tasks like picking items up off the ground. I mean, you need that food for healing, and 99% of the time, you can't get it. As you get a little deeper in and you begin to face more difficult enemies, the entire experience just devolves into a frustrating affair that will leave you scratching your head on how the heck this passed any type of quality control testing. All this is really a shame because the DNA of a possibly decent game is here. It just fails to come together for anyone looking for a competent beat-em-up. I wasn't the only one that hated this game, as pretty much every magazine and website you can think of ripped it apart in their reviews. If you don't believe me, give it a go, and don't say I didn't warn you.
Good shot.
South Park is easily one of my top 5 TV programs of all time. That brand of scathing satire and irreverent humor really hits home for me. So when Chef's Love Shack showed up in November of 1999 courtesy of Acclaim, I just had to play it. Everything on the back of the case made it clear it was done as sort of a game show, where trivia and mini-games were the order of the day. I was fine with that, but once you get into it, it just all falls apart. The structure is done well enough, but this is South Park at its tamest. It lacks the hard edge of the actual show, leaving you a watered-down version that gets kinda boring really fast. This is a shame because it's got all the voices and funny visual stylings otherwise. And once you add in some truly horrific loading times, you have a quiz game that goes nowhere fast. The developers had a neat idea with this, and had they been given full reign to let loose all that South Park has to offer and gotten the technical side right, it might have been a worthwhile release. As it is, it lacks the same edge of the TV show, and once those load times beat you into submission, you'll never play it again. If the content still happens to appeal, play it on a Nintendo 64. At least there, it didn't have the soul-crushing technical issues.
Stand. Hey, NRA! This amendment makes your day. Who says y'all are a bunch of dumbasses?
Sweet.
Mortal Kombat Gold was a launch game for the North American Dreamcast on $9,999 and in Europe on $10,2999. It was based on the 1997 release of Mortal Kombat 4, an arcade game that introduced 3D polygons to the franchise. When you fire this up, the first thought you are likely to have is that it's the best looking home version of Mortal Kombat 4 of that time. And you wouldn't be wrong. It crushed the previous releases on the original PlayStation and the Nintendo 64. But 2 years had passed since the arcade, and 3D graphics were advancing at a rapid pace. But perhaps far more important was the fact that Namco had taken an old 3D fighter themselves and showed you how to remake it for a platform as powerful as the Dreamcast in 1999. Playing this after Soul Calibur feels laughably bad. The gameplay is janky, the flow is so disjointed, and everything just feels so old and uninspired. Aside from some new weapon additions and characters, it's pretty much just a rehash of how Mortal Kombat 3 played way back in 1995. Fans of the series can get some fun from this if they really love the arcade version, but for most fighting game fans, this was a bottom-of-the-barrel rehash that looked, sounded, and played nowhere near as well as the series had in the past. The fire was gone, and this was the first Mortal Kombat I dropped after only a few days of playing it. Not long after the Dreamcast launched, we received NFL Quarterback Club 2000 from Acclaim. I fell for the back of the box hook, line, and sinker. Ultra high-res graphics, motion capture animation, crazy texture detail, revolutionary AI by actual NFL coaches. How could this possibly be bad, I thought? Well, it was. And I should have known better since it had Acclaim on the case, and I had been privy to their sports games before. This abomination plays as bad as NFL 97 on the Saturn, an inexcusable result given the power of the Dreamcast. The gameplay is sluggish and unresponsive, the AI doesn't run the routes properly, the passing game lacks any finesse at all, the running game is ruined by blockers that will actually leave you when you have an opening to exploit. Every aspect of the gameplay is utterly broken, unfinished, or point-blank rage-inducing. I've lost games last minute by blown coverages where my defender never followed the play, leaving the computer a wide-open field to score and win. The only merit you're gonna find in this clunker are the visuals, which have been cleaned up and run better than the original Nintendo 64 version on which it's based. This was also released after Sega's NFL 2K, which should have been a clear indication to Acclaim's management that their game needed about 6 more months of development to improve its quality. There are steaming piles on the Dreamcast, and then there are cesspools of irredeemable awfulness. This is the latter, and a prime example of why Acclaim no longer exists.
Steve Young drops back to pass. And it's incomplete. From the shotgun, 3-step drop for Steve Young.
There was a time when Core Design was a gold standard developer. When one of their games appeared, you could be reasonably assured that it was something worth playing. Even when they landed a dud, it was often still playable and fun to mess around with. But as time went on, we started seeing stuff like Fighting Force 2 here, a woeful 3D beat-em-up that tries its best to capture the fun of the 2D games that came before it. And wow, swinging a colossal miss. Despite having lots of weapons and a fairly easy pick-up-and-play design, everything feels off. You'll fight the analog movement for every twist and turn of the character as you try and line yourself up with doors, crates, enemies, and stairs. It's like trying to play the first Tomb Raider as a beat-em-up. Exacerbating the issue are stages that are far too large, forcing you to run around sterile environments that all look the same, fighting the same few enemies. Core didn't bother adding any new features of notable worth to the button-mashing gameplay either. This feels like something from 1988 dressed up in a 3D engine. The Dreamcast version does look better than the PlayStation edition that came before, but in a way, that actually makes the plain textures and low polygon counts stand out more. By the time you drop a few hours into this bore fest, you realize what a complete waste of time it is. The Dreamcast needed a Streets of Rage 4 or a port of Spike Out, and this low quality trash was simply no substitute. I had loved Core design for years, but they should really be ashamed of this misfire. Have you ever played a game where the concept itself screamed for you to try it out? That was certainly the case with 1999's 7th Cross Evolution. It's here that you are dropped into a mysterious world as a simple creature that must evolve, grow more powerful, conquer enemies, and discover the meaning of it all. It's described as a simulation, and that is honestly quite accurate. This really does feel like you are waiting to evolve all the time. Everything happens at a snail's pace. Once a change does present itself, you happily grab up the opportunity, only to be thrust right back into nothing happening for long stretches. This occurs mainly as you must explore your environment and consume the life around you. The world is broken up into sections and is massive, but there is often nothing to see but empty environments, and oh man does it take forever to get anywhere. The way you design your life form is not intuitive at all, but you can end up with a unique look nearly every time. There is so much potential here, if only the pacing was more exciting. The visuals also needed a huge boost, as this is early polygon level stuff that looks far more at home on lesser hardware. I mean, this is the Dreamcast for God's sake. There are a number of games that tried a similar design as 7th Cross, but none of them had as much potential. As it is, however, it just takes too much time and lacks the visual flair to hold your interest. With the internet so young, it was still easy to be victimized by a magazine review in 2000. That's exactly what happened to me when I saw the write-up for Championship Surfer, proclaiming it a decent game worth looking into. I mean, it was the official Dreamcast magazine in the US. What could possibly go wrong? Unfortunately, everything. This game is a turd, plain and simple. None of the fun of games like Tony Hawk's Pro Skater can be found here. In order for a surfing video game to be fun, it has to be a bit unrealistic. Waves would need to last longer so your runs aren't 5 seconds at a time. But this mess goes way beyond that. The camera is terrible. The physics are utter trash. Each session lasts a very short amount of time, and good lord, what was the point of putting obstacles like explosive mines and crates in the main game mode? It's hard enough to stay on your board for any real length of time, but then in every mode but the free run, there are things in the water to knock you off your board, turning a potentially average game into one that makes you scream with frustration more often than not. Championship Surfer is also one ugly game. The water looks bad, and there is no detail outside of that. Funny enough, years later, I found a review for this in the UK's official Dreamcast magazine, which gave the game a wildly different review than the US version of the publication. It made me realize this one has its fans, but I certainly am not one of them. I would say it couldn't be any worse, but then again, there was a PlayStation version of this mess as well. Acclaim was back again in 2000 with yet another attempt to steal your money with Jeremy McGrath's Supercross 2000. This dirt bike racer manages to defy the laws of physics and look like a PlayStation game all at the same time. There's no challenge at all. The bikes feel nothing like they should. The tricks are a joke, and despite being ugly as sin, the game manages to run poorly as well. Just hold the accelerator down, ride the walls, never fall off your bike, and win second place every single time. Not even features like a track editor and multiple race options can save this mess. Acclaim knew this steaming pile was busted and released it at a discount price, which should have been everyone's first clue that something was seriously wrong. Like a lot of these terrible releases, this one was ported from weaker hardware, this time the Nintendo 64. But at least there you had aging hardware to blame things on. On the Dreamcast, there was more than enough power to at least make the game look pretty and run well. You don't even get that much. The Dreamcast was strangled with half-assed ports like this, and it was a problem its entire life. But when Acclaim was involved, you were almost always guaranteed a loser, and Supercross 2000 is yet another black eye on a legacy marred by terrible multi-platform efforts. You ever played a game that just felt like it got worse the more time you put into it? That was the case with 2000's Urban Chaos for me. Even now, all these years later, I still feel like I hate this a little more each time I fire it up. I think much of that feeling comes from the fact that this could have been something really special had things been tighter. Imagine for a moment all the things you loved about Grand Theft Auto 3, and you have a shadow of the potential of Urban Chaos. Basically, you have the run of a massive city as you hunt down criminals and try and figure out why things have gotten so out of hand. You have access to vehicles, weapons, and a hand-to-hand combat system that allows you to beat down criminals with various punches, kicks, throws, and combos. And that right there should have made for one hell of a good game in 2000. There just wasn't a lot like this at the time, and yet the potential is completely squandered by an execution that completely ruins it. Your basic control feels stiff, yet is extremely over-responsive. The hand-to-hand combat feels disjointed and lacks impact. The control of the vehicle is point-blank broken. The enemies are repetitive. The missions are too long. The draw distance is too short. The performance dips regularly and is never smooth. Hell, just completing the tutorial is an act of sheer willpower. By the time you get to the city at large, you find yourself avoiding lots of activities and interactions because it just plays so poorly. Again, the shame here is that lurking beneath these issues is a game that could have been an unforgettable classic. Instead, you are left with a really bad taste of what could have been. Our last steaming pile of irredeemable shit is none other than the Spirit of Speed 1937. This shows up on many worst of lists for good reason. Originally released in 2000, it was published under the LJN label, a clear attempt to hide the fact that it was yet another stinker from Acclaim, who owned the brand. I'm not sure who the hell thought this was a good idea, but here's the gist. This allows you to race cars from the 1930s with an authentic 1930s presentation. Yep, that means music, race tracks, and everything else that goes along with that. And that there is the entire problem. The age of the machines and the tracks means that there is so little here to see and do, and it really does lack excitement. The tracks have no detail, the cars are simple, it's painfully slow, the racing feels so ho-hum and never gets your blood pumping. Every single time you press start to run a race, you feel like it's exactly the same, like you are stuck in some time loop or something. The environments are sterile as well, with nothing happening to make you feel like you were part of a real sporting event. This would have been a mild curiosity had it been a mode in a much larger game, but for the entire thing to be centered on these cars, these tracks, and this era, man, what a terrible idea that didn't need an entire game designed around it. I can't say I'm surprised Acclaim was part of it, and it's yet another embarrassment from a company that just had no shame. Spirit of Speed is one of the worst Dreamcast racers by a country mile. This episode could have almost been called Terrible Acclaim Games on the Sega Dreamcast. They were certainly responsible for some of the worst for the platform, but they by no means were alone. I think a lot of the problem with these titles were they were moved over from other platforms with little regard for improvement. We were also still quite early in the development of fully polygonal engines with analog control, so gameplay was still kinda rough in many respects. That might have been one of the main issues of the Dreamcast's early launch. By landing so early, they were essentially still grappling with the issues Nintendo and Sony still had with their PlayStation and Nintendo 64 development. By the time many of these issues began to get resolved in 2001, the Dreamcast was dead, never having the chance to see the improvements. This was surely the case with releases like Urban Chaos, that would have benefited greatly from dual analog stick control and more time in the oven. Thankfully, the Dreamcast had a load of great games to offset these stinkers, but no doubt the low scores in magazines these games saw made people balk at purchasing the console early in its life. I mean, it wasn't rare to see multi-platform Dreamcast games get absolutely hammered by magazines and websites of the time. Scores that were often even worse than the previous generation releases. That deluge of bad ports never showed what the Dreamcast was truly capable of, paving the way for the PlayStation 2 to steal all of its thunder. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.